This tension exists in the West and in Eastern thought between pursuing individual enlightenment or being, making the world a better place, basically, and helping mankind. So the tension is, look, people would say, well, look, if you get too engaged with public life and trying to help other people, you can kind of drive yourself crazy that way if you don't look after your own mental health. Like you might start to get too worked up about the injustices that you perceive in society, like too frustrated, too angry. It can become quite unhealthy. So you need to enlighten yourself in order to be able to help other people. But then if you spend too much time in a cave meditating, trying to enlighten yourself, it seems like you're not really helping society at all.
Let's go. Welcome to Citizen. We got a special guest today, Donald Robertson. That's donaldrobertson.name. That's your website. All sorts of good information on there about Stoics and things like that. We'll get into all that soon. But first, tell me where you grew up.
I grew up in Scotland. I might be able to figure that out from the fact that I've got a funny accent and my name sounds pretty Scottish as well. But occasionally people think I'm Irish or something. But no, I'm a Scot. But I immigrated to Canada about a decade ago.
What would you say the difference between like for the layman between Scotch people and Irish people? I'm not trying to get you to talk shit, but if you want to talk a little shit, that's fine too.
They're quite. I mean, we're all Celts, right? We're all Celts, basically. Scots, like the Ireland, the Republic of Ireland is a Catholic country, and Scotland is predominantly Protestant. So there's traditionally some religious differences and rivalry there. We spell whiskey differently. We we invented golf. Well, I think we're pretty similar. We've got a lot in common with the Irish. We view them as kind of our cousins. Scotland, here's a bit of trivia for you. Scotland means land of the Irish. Not a lot of people know that.
And what, in Gaelic it means that?
It's in some ancient language, the Romans said that the Irish were called the Scotai, and so they call Scotland as it means the land of the Irish. But even a lot of Scottish people don't know that.
I've never heard that before.
It's a fact.
And what part of Scotland are you from?
Oh, I come from a place called Ayr, which is kind of south of Glasgow. It's on the coast. We've got a few castles, and it's best known for being the birthplace of Robert Burns, our national bard. You know, the guy that wrote Auld Lang Syne that you sing every New Year's Eve? Yeah. Like, that's where I come from.
There you go. And what was it like growing up there? I mean, you live in Canada now, but and I'm sure you've spent some amount of time in the U.S. as well, and probably in other parts of the UK as well. What was growing up in Scotland like?
It was pretty cool. I used to play in the ruins of castles when I was a kid. Like, it's probably going to seem a lot bit odd to a lot of Americans.
That's pretty awesome.
My wife's American, by the way. She's from Michigan. So when I tell her that, she's always kind of finds it a bit odd. But yeah, we used to climb on the castles and play in them, and always playing in the countryside, constantly getting scratches and cuts from falling out of trees and stuff like that. I had a great childhood.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, actually, minus the castles. Mine was more trailer parks than castles, but still plenty of cuts and scrapes and falling out of trees and whatnot. Yeah, it seems like our generations were some of the last to really have unscheduled outdoor, unmonitored playtime. Whereas, well, maybe it's different over there, but here in the U.S., it's kind of been a big problem for us.
Yeah, I think I've got mixed feelings about it. When I look back, I think I benefited in many ways from the kind of rough and tumble of when I was growing up as a kid. But I'd also kind of hesitate to allow my little girl for example, to do some of the stuff that I did when I was a kid. I look back, it was kind of dangerous. I nearly died several times as a child. I nearly drowned. I think I nearly drowned 2 or 3 times as a kid. And, I don't want my child to have a sheltered upbringing, but I don't want to drown either. So, I think maybe I'd strike the balance slightly differently. And actually, you asked me what was different. One of the other things that was different, I don't know if this was the case in America, or in part of America that you're from, but when I was a kid in Scotland, we still had corporal punishment in schools. Like, so you would get lashed across the
Oh, yeah.
palms of your hand with a leather strap on a regular basis. And only I often think that's one of the biggest differences. Like, that's not a thing in education today. It's not something I miss, having experienced it a lot as a child, but it's definitely a big difference.
Certainly, yeah. When I was in high school, you don't really get any of that, but elementary and middle school, I made numerous visits to the principal's office for some of that corporal punishment that we all are fond of. But yeah, it's certainly not a thing anymore. You would get sued immediately for that. So, and I don't think, I mean, looking back on it, certainly, we can talk more about this since you're a bit of an expert, but I don't think it works terribly well. Just like even with, if you think about the way that classical conditioning works, all the research on classical conditioning shows that reward-based training is way more effective, right? So I just don't, and then, you got to take into account, and there's many books on this. I'm not an expert myself, but you have to take into account that usually when you're, when people hit their kids, spank their kids, whatever, they're doing it in frustration or anger, and that's not appropriate either, right? So it's not like, I understand the spare the rod, spoil the child idea. It makes sense to me that you should definitely discipline your kids. There's no question about that. But there's some gray between, cracking your kid upside the head and, like some real discipline. It's got to be effective downstream. That should be the most important part.
Well, when I was like about 16 or something, thereabouts, I started to become a little bit nerdy and read a lot of books. And I read B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And it kind of blew my mind because I recognized a lot of the stuff that he was describing about reward and punishment and the psychological effects that it has. So Skinner said, well, the problem with corporal punishment is that, first of all, people kind of get used to it if you use it a lot. And I was like, yeah, that's totally right. Like me and the other little boys that are always getting the strap, we just laugh it off. Like it doesn't really work on us anymore. So you have to increase the intensity of it, and that becomes problematic. How severely do you have to punish these kids before it continues to be effective? And then Skinner said the other thing is that you reward people you reward them indirectly for avoiding punishment. So you make them more rebellious. And I thought, he's absolutely right. It just made me really angry and rebellious against authority. So it kind of had the opposite of the desired effect. And I found that I think it was the first time I felt really validated by something that I read in a book. I thought this psychologist, based on his experiments training animals and things like that, has arrived at these sort of conclusions that seem completely consistent with what I experienced in day-to-day life as a result of punishment. He's right. It didn't make me more well-behaved. It just made me more obstinate and rebellious against authority.
And I think the opposite of that, you were probably, you probably had the kind of disposition that would lead to that reaction, but somebody that might have had a more affected disposition may just have shrunk into themselves and lost all kinds of social contact or social capabilities, right? Because that happens as well.
It would be broken.
Yeah, it's usually one or the other. You either shy away into your turtle shell or you become a mad asshole, right? That's the choice I made as well. I went nuts. So I'm on board with you on that one. And you're let's talk about your career a little bit. Where did you begin? Because you certainly cognitive behavioral specialist, which is something that the veteran community, my community, knows quite a bit about, or they should by now, right? Just because it's kind of the most effective treatment for most stuff that we deal with. How did you get into that originally?
Well, let's go back a bit. I said I came from Burns country, we call it in Scotland, right? My My father passed away when I was quite young, and that's part of the reason I was becoming very rebellious and things. I was about 13 when my father died of lung cancer, and I kind of went off the rails. I didn't have a father figure. I was getting into a lot of trouble with the cops and things like that. However, my father, like, I think all of my friends' fathers, was a Freemason because Robert Burns was a master Freemason. And so it's part of the culture in my hometown. It goes back centuries. And so my father left behind not much. He left behind his smoking pipes and some of his tool shed, and he left behind a bunch of books on Freemasonry. And I started looking at them. I'd never read anything like that. And I found all these religious references to the Old Testament and references to Pythagoras and Plato. And I was like, who are these guys? And this is some stuff about the four cardinal virtues. And so I got into trying to figure out what this was about. And I began reading books on Christianity, on the Kabbalah, on Gnosticism, on world religions, on philosophy. I read Plato, I read about Pythagoras. So I became really, really into philosophy. And I think I was looking for, I think in a way I was looking for a replacement for a father figure. I was looking for something to give me a philosophy of life, a kind of sense of direction, right? Because I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing in life. And I thought maybe by reading all these books, I'll get some kind of roadmap. Nobody's going to tell me what sort of man I should become, as an adolescent. Like, I need to kind of figure out a roadmap for myself by reading Plato, apparently. And I ended up going to university. I did my first degree in philosophy, loved it, but it kind of made me more confused. So by the end of it, I was reading Heidegger and Wittgenstein and stuff, but it wasn't really giving me the sort of Western yoga or the philosophy of life that I was looking for. And then after I graduated, I discovered Stoic philosophy. And I began training in psychotherapy and counseling. And I immediately realized that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the leading evidence-based form of modern psychotherapy, was directly inspired by ancient Stoic philosophy. Now, Stoic philosophy is one of the few major schools of ancient philosophy that is not studied in the undergraduate philosophy curriculum normally. And I would ask my friends who are academic philosophers about that, and what they would say was kind of funny. They would say, well, why would we study the Stoics? Because they take concepts from Plato and Aristotle and other great thinkers, and all they do is kind of figure out how they would apply it in day-to-day life. So why would anyone want to study that? And I thought, well, that's why I want to study it, right? I want to know how you would apply it in daily life. And so I became really interested in the Stoics, and I became really interested in how it relates to cognitive therapy. And that was over 25 years ago. And, I pursued a clinical career instead of an academic career. But then over time, I began writing more and more books. I probably spend more time writing, researching books and stuff like that now, although I still see clients a couple of days a week. That's how my career evolved as a specialist in the relationship between ancient philosophy and modern psychotherapy.
What do you think it is about, I guess, well, let me back up to you specifically. So, your career trajectory, or at least your educational to career trajectory, kind of very similar to my own. Like, I had planned on going into the military no matter what. When I was in high school, then 9/11 happened, and I was like, I'm definitely going in now. But I took a beat and went to a very small university, Christian university, seminary actually, to learn about comparative religion before I went. And it wasn't necessarily, like, I'm not particularly religious. I never have been. But it seemed to me a good idea to try to figure out, like, if I wanted to figure out people and how they thought, trying to understand how they rationalize their place in the universe was a good place to start with that, right? And religion is the certainly some texts are more reliable than others, just as is the case with any kind of historical document. But there's no greater volume of text than religion and philosophy when it comes to how people think ever. No matter where in the world you are, you could find that somewhere, right? About the locals or even the broader culture and how they think. And it seemed like a good idea to me to do that. And, I didn't really think about it at the time, but there probably was some measure of a lack of guidance from my dad that led to that. Because I just, like, if your dad's a farmer then you know what you're going to be. You know, if you're 200 years ago, if your dad's a farmer, you know you're going to be a farmer. It's just the way it is, right? And that takes a lot of weight off you. You can, you know, go be the best possible farmer you can be, or maybe you venture out and do something else. But I think in the modern age with so many choices, that paralysis by analysis stuff is a real thing for a lot of kids. And it's interesting now that we probably need to take another look at how we're doing stuff now, because we're still asking kids to make lifelong decisions at 17, 18, 19 years old. And I'm not sure that's appropriate anymore. But, you know, it is what it is. You still got to become an adult. But at any rate, I like that. That we're going down the same path so far in our life up to our teen or early 20s years. I took off and went to war for a while. It wasn't really like the Hemingway thing for me. I was pissed off and I wanted to fuck somebody up because one, I was just generally angry, but two, I don't think I knew it yet, but my brain was searching for some kind of positive outlet for the anger I felt. And that's something that I don't know if it's a result of the helicopter parenting or the bastardization of liberalism, but you know, liberalism used to be a pretty good thing. Now it's not quite such a good thing. And I don't know what it was exactly, but I could feel myself being drawn towards something bigger than myself. Like I knew that it wasn't just me. It can't be. If you stare in the mirror too long, you turn into flowers. You know what I mean? Like narcissists did. So what was it for you, I guess, about the Stoics specifically that drew you in? Because it seems like every 200 years or so, the West figures out the Stoics exist again. And like, oh man, these guys are pretty smart. We should listen to what they said. And like, well, we should have done that the whole fucking time, dude.
Yeah. The way I remember it was that I was interested in three different things. I was interested in philosophy because I wanted to understand the meaning of life, kind of, basically. And I was interested in meditation and self-hypnosis and self-help stuff. Like, for some reason, I guess I did martial arts when I was a kid, and that partly got me into meditation because I was reading books about it and stuff. And I was interested in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and things like that because I wanted to kind of try and figure out a way that maybe I could be useful and help other people. But this meant I was reading a lot of books. I was reading huge amounts of books about meditation and self-help, huge amounts of books about philosophy and religion, and huge amounts of books about psychotherapy. And it was kind of blowing my mind. It was overwhelming. And then I picked up Seneca, I think, and read him. And it was like everything crystallized. And I remember thinking, this has got stuff about contemplative exercises like meditation. It's the basis of cognitive therapy. It's got a whole philosophy of this has got everything in one place. I could just read Seneca and I wouldn't have to read Heidegger and Wittgenstein and Freud and Jung and Chuang Tzu and Lao Tzu and all this other stuff. Like, I'm getting all the things I need from this combined together. And so Stoicism was the first thing I discovered that seemed to combine all of my interests. And at first I thought, this is probably another fad that I'm going to be into. But it wasn't. It stuck with me, like, to the present day. You know, I just clicked and found something that satisfied all of the needs that I had at that time. And like you, I was really angry as a young guy. I think partly because the corporal punishment and stuff, but also I grew up in quite a bit of a rough area. And long story short, I was kind of caught between sort of different gangs and things and different estates. And, I kind of had to defend myself a bit and either avoid getting in fights or, sometimes get in scrapes as a kid. And by the time I was like in my late teens, early 20s, I think I thought I was a tough guy, and I was certainly pretty angry. I mean, I was constantly thinking about ways to get revenge against, people that had rubbed me up the wrong way or whatever. And I realized, the poet William Blake said, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would succeed in becoming wise. And that resonated with me because I thought, yes, sometimes when you get so deep into a problem, you reach a point where you think, I have to change this and do something about it. And I was so angry. In a way, it helped me because I thought, I need to stop being angry. Like, I just need to do something about this. Like, because it's kind of not healthy,
Yeah.
and it's taking over my life. So I think it took me years, but by the time I was in my late 20s, I think I'd kind of largely overcome most of my anger. And I saw the Stoics teaching similar things, and that really resonated with me. And reading Stoicism was one of the things that helped me to address what I saw as, one of the big problems that was affecting my personality at the time.
Yeah. Well, so you're a cognitive behavioral therapy specialist, and again, something that's very familiar to a lot of people in the veteran community. And I think there's a lot of things that keep dudes like me from going and figuring their shit out, to be honest, right? But one of the ones that is like there's shame, there's and you make up excuses. Oh, I don't have time for that, whatever. But one of them that I think is legitimate that needs to be addressed is the fact that we don't want to lose our edge, right? Like we see ourselves and have fashioned ourselves as protectors and gone to great lengths to make ourselves quite good at it. You know what I mean? And the vision that always pops into my head is like a professional athlete retiring at the end of their career, just like this tough dude weeping because he can't do the thing he loves anymore. Like, well, you don't have to stop being a protector because of that, but you certainly got to. I think that is for a lot of guys their rock bottom, and they never make it out of that again. But it shouldn't be, right? It should be a springboard to the next thing. You just got to find what that next thing happens to be. And for me, it's been a long process because I didn't really have a whole lot of assistance there, but I think there's quite a bit more assistance now. As far as not wanting to lose your edge, I wouldn't say that I'm not angry anymore. I just I tell people this a lot. You should inhale your rage and then exhale some purpose, because if you just sit with it or lash out at people, directed anger is a very powerful weapon. And but it requires effort. We spend all this time working out our bodies and not enough working out our minds, like the ability to manage to emotionally regulate. You know what I mean? To hear something that makes you angry right now, experience that anger and put it in your back pocket for later use is something that men need to learn how to do, period. It doesn't matter if you're a warrior or not. All men need to learn how to do that.
All right. Let's open a can of worms.
Yeah, let's do it.
Right? Let's do it. Right? There's a controversy in the history of philosophy, and to some extent it kind of segues into psychotherapy. So, bit of trivia, not a lot of people know this. Many people believe that psychotherapy began with Freud or someone like that, which is definitely not true. Freud himself trained in psychotherapy. Modern psychotherapy was around for about 50 years before Freud even came along, right? But actually, psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. The Stoics wrote books on psychotherapy, believe it or not. It was a discipline that explicitly existed in the ancient world. And there was an argument in ancient psychotherapy, as it were. We have an entire book by Seneca that survives today called On Anger, about the Stoic psychotherapy for anger. And in it, Seneca argues with the Aristotelians. And the Aristotelians say there's this thing called justified anger, or righteous anger, or healthy anger. So some anger could potentially be useful if you channel it in the right direction, or you control it, or whatever. And Seneca says, well, the Stoic position is that actually all anger is unhealthy. And he argues about this at length. He does a real deep dive into it. So I like to be kind of bipartisan. I lean a bit towards Seneca's position, but I think what's really interesting is the debate. It's an interesting discussion to hear people having. The main other tradition that I think agrees with the Stoics, funnily enough, is the Buddhists. So in the Buddhist tradition, they tend to view all anger as inherently unhelpful or a hindrance. And rather than something that you should kind of channel or you try to use in a constructive way. Most other ancient traditions, and probably the majority of people today, think that you can make a distinction between good and bad anger, or healthy and unhealthy anger. Now, the way that most people do it is they'll say, well, if your anger is really extreme, if it's very intense, maybe that's unhealthy. But if it's kind of mild anger, then maybe you can channel it or control it. But I don't think out the gate that's a very good way of making the distinction, because many people have quite low intensity anger that simmers for a long period of time and can lead them to do really unhealthy and destructive things. For example, there are many passive-aggressive people in the world that maybe do even more harm than people that are openly aggressive. And they might not be experiencing a very high intensity of anger. It might feel like it's at a low ebb or a low intensity, but do more damage, right? So we need to maybe think more carefully about how to distinguish good anger from bad anger rather than just judging it on how strong the feelings are, possibly. But I would say the main counter-argument against the idea that you can have healthy anger, the Stoics said anger is temporary madness. And their point was that the problem with anger is that it clouds our judgment, right? So the other parties, the Aristotelians, would say that anger is like a dangerous weapon. But as long as you think clearly and use your judgment soundly, you could control it. Seneca says, but that's not possible, because anger by its very nature contaminates your judgment. Like, it clouds your judgment. It impairs your ability to evaluate the consequences of your actions. So even low levels of anger can make you bad at judging whether anger is healthy or unhealthy. And that's really the root of the problem. So I think I would just encourage your listeners to think about that question and explore those two perspectives more than anything else, and more than necessarily coming down on one side. Albert Ellis, the guy who founded cognitive behavioral therapy, was very influenced by the Stoics. And he came close to agreeing with the Stoics. He said he thought virtually all anger was unhealthy and irrational. And he said he thought if people describe their anger as justified or healthy, it's often a euphemism, and it can be risky to do that. It can be a slippery slope. So he said, actually, I think it's better to just assume that all anger is unhealthy, and there's probably a better way of responding to the problems that you're facing. But that's unusual. Most subsequent cognitive behavioral therapists adopt this more common position that says there's good anger and there's bad anger, basically. So I think it's very interesting to kind of pick that apart and try and evaluate how would we tell what the difference is between healthy and unhealthy anger.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I'm not sure that any root emotions are charged. You know what I mean? I don't know if they're negative or positive or negative by their nature. I think maybe it is the all of the circumstances involved in it. Like, for example, if you are a person who, if you're a normal and well-adjusted person and you see somebody being abused, that should give you, you should feel some anger rise in you, in addition to empathy. Like, two of those things are going to happen. Like, if you're more positioned towards, or disposition rather towards empathy, you feel that more. But if I see somebody getting abused in my presence, that generates anger in me. I will not allow that to happen. And maybe anger is not the right word for it. You know what I mean? I don't know. But that's
the other thing. Yeah, the semantics of it. Like, we have a very limited emotional vocabulary, and this is where we start to kind of stretch it a little bit, because are there different types of anger? Like, are we sometimes talking about frustration when we use the word anger? Like, I think we probably, at this point, we probably start to feel like we need a better vocabulary to be clear about it. I think you're right, but here's some things that might give us pause for thought, right? There are some people who box or do martial arts who claim that anger helps them. But generally, when I talk to people who are experienced in combat sports, they often seem to feel that anger can be unhelpful, and that making their opponents angry actually potentially gives them an advantage. I mean, a good example of that would be Muhammad Ali boxing George Foreman. Like, Ali deliberately taunted George Foreman to try and get him to lose his temper, because he thought one of the things that psychological research tells us about anger, is that it introduces a whole bunch of cognitive biases, right? It does cloud our judgment in a number of ways that we can actually measure and specify, even at low levels of intensity. And one of the main things that anger does is that it seems to, when people are anxious, they often overestimate risk, right? So they become frightened of their own shadow when they're highly anxious, right? Anger seems to do the opposite. And when people get angry, they seem to typically underestimate the risks that they're facing. Now, that can mean that they expose themselves and maybe other people around them to more danger. And I think in George Foreman's case, he tired himself out too early in the fight, so he underestimated the risk of doing that because he was getting wound up by Ali. So one of the things that gives me pause for thought is I think anger, it looks like it could be potentially useful in a threatening situation, but there are many people who seem to me to be quite experienced at dealing with threatening situations that seem to feel that anger could potentially be a disadvantage, and it's better to keep a cool head.
It definitely could be. There's no question about that. Like there's certainly some space between anger and rage. Where you're mindless, and maybe that's one of the times that we actually got the words right. But we also have these euphemisms like righteous indignation, and that's just usually somebody that's trying to backstop their behavior, to be honest. But there also, when you're in one of those amygdala triggering situations, there are physiological effects that happen. You produce cortisol, you produce adrenaline, the blood rushes to your extremities, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff happens, right? And yeah, I would certainly, it's true that anger being helpful isn't a constant thing. You could, that's certainly that's not true. We can everybody can think of an example of when they've been angry and done some stupid shit. I guess it depends on a lot of things. One, I think it would depend to some great degree on your natural disposition. I mean, as a matter of fact, one of the most common physical attributes that special operators have in common with each other, this is globally, not just the U.S., is that they burn on average, they burn cortisol 30 to 50% faster than their counterparts. Even in other people in the military, they burn cortisol faster. There's also a high proclivity or not a high proclivity, but a high amount of people who had rough childhoods, right? So maybe that's what's informing that physiology. Hard to say on that, but certainly I can see people who've done dumb shit in a rage situation. You can just go on YouTube and look at people driving and think about that. But I think I would agree that it is a dangerous weapon, and that we should realize that it exists and not pretend that it doesn't. I don't like, personally, I think that abstinence doesn't work. I've just, maybe for some people it does, but on average, if something has so much control over you, you have to pretend it doesn't exist or avoid it, then it still has control over you. That's always been my position. Now, maybe for some people it helps throughout their lives, but I've seen more failures than successes in that regard. So when I'm thinking about this, I always think of Carl Sagan. For me, it's better to accept the universe as it is rather than persist in delusion, regardless of how satisfying the delusion is. And pretending things don't exist or that something is too much for me, it feels like you're treating yourself like a child to some degree, and then you get into a real world situation, you're completely unprepared for it.
What do you mean, like pretending that anger doesn't exist?
Well, no, I mean like just suppressing it all the time. Because you can say that there's no such thing as good anger, but how does a human being employ that into their life? I don't know. I don't know. You know what I mean?
You can change your in cognitive therapy. There's pretty solid evidence that shows that cognitive therapy is pretty moderately to highly effective in general for anger management.
Oh yeah, for sure. But degrees, right? Degrees. Like I remember when I first started CBT back in the day, and my therapist was a Vietnam vet. He had this chart, I can't remember what it was called, but it went from +8 all the way down to -8. And he was like, people are on this scale somewhere. You're either you're either level somewhere near 0, or you're depressed somewhere near -8, or you're excited somewhere near +8, or maybe it was 10, I don't remember. But he was like, you're walking around, I guess it was 10, because he's like, you're walking around at an 8 right now pretty much all the time, and it only takes a little bit to get you to 10. But if we can get you down to like a 0, 1, or 2, then it takes quite a bit more to get you up there, and by the time you get up there, you know that you're there for a reason. That's kind of how he explained it to me.
Well, I guess one of the things I'd add is, like, I think normally we talk about our emotions as if they're simple, kind of homogenous things. Most people, there's this thing that psychologists and philosophers call folk psychology, which means the kind of default assumptions that the majority of people have about how the mind works. And the folk psychology of emotion is sometimes described as a sort of hydraulic model. So people think of anger as like a force or an energy that wells up within them, and it can be suppressed or pushed down, or it can be channeled like into different activities, or it can be vented or purged from the system. But most modern researchers think that's not really how anger functions or what it looks like. It's an oversimplification. But that's how our language of anger works. That's how most of us tend to think about it.
Mm.
So the Stoics had a more sophisticated set of assumptions about how emotion works. So rather than thinking of anger as just a kind of energy that wells up within us, the Stoics first of all had a cognitive model. So they thought anger isn't just how you feel, it's also how you think. In order for an emotion to be called anger, it has to consider certain beliefs and attitudes and ways of thinking. So the modern theory, what we call the cognitive appraisal theory of emotion, is that when your fight or flight response is triggered, your body produces adrenaline and other hormones, like there's certain physiological reactions that happen, and then you interpret those either as fear or anger or in a number of other ways. So you kind of combine the physiological response with certain beliefs and assumptions and judgments about your situation. You can give people drugs that produce adrenaline in their body and lead them to believe that the drugs are causing them to feel anxiety, or lead them to believe that the drugs cause euphoria, or that they cause anger. And that's what they'll typically experience. Like they'll project that interpretation onto the physiological symptoms that they notice, a heart beating faster and stuff like that, right? So from that point of view, you might say, okay, when you're faced with a threat, say someone walks up to you in the street and spits in your face, right? You're going to have a reaction to that. Like it'd be like a reflex. Your fight or flight response is going to be triggered. But then you arguably you have some control. You can shape whether that's channeled towards anger, or whether it becomes anxiety, or whether you turn it into some other kind of response, right? People often say that the main benefit that they assign to anger, not the only benefit, but probably the most common benefit that people attribute to anger is they say it motivates them to fight injustice. So it kind of gives them an adrenaline rush and it makes them stronger and more aggressive and able to kind of address problems that they perceive. But arguably, it's not really the anger that does that. It's the fact that the fight or flight response has been triggered. Your heart rate's already increased. You've already produced adrenaline before you even frame it as anger. Right.
Yeah, that's kind of Adlerian of you to say, I guess, right? I mean, he would say that you generate these emotions to justify what you want to do anyways.
Yeah, and you know, we talk about anger, fear, sadness as if they're kind of on a level. They're all just different labels for emotion, but anger often seems to function a little bit differently in that, in many cases, anger seems to be what psychologists call a secondary emotion. It's almost more like a coping strategy. Like so Aaron T. Beck, who was the other main pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy, he interviewed hundreds of clients and got them to keep meticulous records about their anger. And he said in virtually every single case that he spoke to, when the clients observed their feelings very closely and kept records, so they didn't necessarily see this initially, but only when they looked closely. When they became angry, there was almost always a preceding emotion. So they felt anxious or hurt or offended, and then they got angry in response to that. There's like, it could be a split second, or in some cases it might take quite a while. You know, someone might feel really hurt for hours or days, and then suddenly start to get angry about it in retrospect. But for many people, it's almost instantaneous. So we can view anger in some ways almost as a way of coping with other emotions, right? Then we have to ask, is it the best way of coping? The Stoics also made another distinction, which is between what they called the proto-passions, or the initial involuntary aspect of an emotion, and then how we choose to respond subsequently. We don't normally make that distinction in everyday language. Seneca makes it fundamental to his book on anger. So he says there's this initial reaction, like the fight or flight response, which is automatic and reflex-like, And like you say, you can't really suppress that. It wouldn't be healthy to do that. The healthy response is probably to accept the feeling and kind of observe it and maybe ride it out. But what you do a split second later is potentially more under your voluntary control. Like, so how you behave, what you say, for example, might be something that you're choosing to do. It might be colored more by your assumptions and your way of thinking. So that could potentially change. So when people say, well, is it not unhealthy to suppress your emotions? Shouldn't we accept your emotions? We should probably make a distinction between the automatic and the voluntary aspects of emotion. So it's probably healthy to accept the automatic phase of emotion, but you can take control and responsibility over the voluntary aspects of emotion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's right. People will use what's called the proto-passion to kind of justify the downstream emotion.
Yeah, it's very common because people don't make any distinction. It's like we allow ourselves to be driven by these automatic thoughts and feelings that pop into our mind, and then we just carry on ruminating about it or complaining about it or behaving aggressively as if we don't have any choice about it. But you could have that initial flash of emotion or that initial aggressive thought and take a step back from it or walk away, or challenge it. Like you have options about how you respond to it. You don't have to be, as the Stoics put it, they say it's like being swept along with it. And the Stoics say you don't have to be swept along with it. You can, in their terminology, they say you can withhold your assent from it, or you can take a step back from your initial reaction.
Yeah, there's the first thing you should master is yourself. I've heard that spoken by some folks before. It seems like a good idea. I do think that this requires a great deal of effort on our part as human beings, especially as men. And then if you work in a violent profession, I think you have to double your efforts, to be honest. Because if you spend enough time on the battlefield, everywhere feels like the battlefield, and it's not. It's just not. You know what I mean? And it's something that we've struggled with quite a bit. And our governments haven't done too much to, one, keep us out of stupid places, but also to help us once we get back. And
I wonder actually if I can ask you a question about that. So one of the problems that Seneca identifies, and a problem that we can identify today with anger, is that when you get angry, say somebody calls me a dumbass on social media, right, and I think, man, that guy's really offended me. I'm kind of annoyed with him. Then my wife asks me what I want for dinner. I might kind of snap at her a bit because I'm still angry with this dude that provoked me online. That's a pretty common occurrence, I think.
Yes.
So there's a tendency for anger to generalize. Some psychologists used to say we displace anger, but I think of it in a slightly different way. It's more like it just spreads out because we're in an angry state of mind. So now we're going to perceive other interactions with even our loved ones through that angry state of mind, right? Our judgment's biased in a bunch of ways that predispose us towards aggression because somebody's triggered that. And we're in that angry mode of functioning. It's going to pollute our other relationships. So when people think, well, maybe anger could be useful in some situations, Seneca says, well, there are a number of concerns about that you'd want to think through. And one of them is this tendency for anger to generalize. So even if you think, I might be able to use anger in some situations, that maybe it could be useful in certain sports, perhaps. But then afterwards, is that still going to maybe affect my mood for the rest of the day if I'm not careful? Or if I use anger to accomplish certain tasks, am I going to make myself more prone to anger in general? Am I going to create a kind of habit of getting angry? And then, if I'm not feeling well one day and my kids are being annoying, am I going to be more likely to lose my temper and snap at them? How can I be sure that I keep my anger compartmentalized so I only apply it in these situations? Seneca thinks that's a problem for people that want to use anger. The term that we sometimes use is to use anger instrumentally, to treat it as if it's kind of a tool. But it's a tool that we kind of lose control of quite easily.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's something that has to be not just monitored, but you have to actually do work beforehand to make sure that you're capable of doing that before you expose yourself to it. Because I mean, I kind of think of it like tightening the lug nuts on your car before you go out and press the gas pedal. You know what I mean? If you're like, well, the gas pedal exists, that'll make me go forward, and you don't think of anything else, and you press it and the wheels fall off, then you're in a bit of pain there. And you also don't. You're talking about compartmentalizing. We don't go to, like, if you don't go to the gym or work on the outside on the farm all day and then come home and keep those clothes on all night. That's not how it works. You take them off. And, if you want to learn how to compartmentalize, if that's possible for you, some people maybe it isn't or isn't, but if you want to learn how to do that stuff, you better practice it, because you can't just decide to do things. I mean, we have these proto passions, as they're called, or just like let's call it, and just the initial instinct, whatever it happens to be, my instinctual reaction to something, and that's fine. That is what it is. Certainly, you could work on that too, in my opinion. I think those are trigger responses, and that's all. Like, most of that is mental and physiological, or mental and chemical. You can definitely work on those as well, but you are going to have immediate responses to some things. Sometimes they're appropriate, sometimes they're not, and you get to choose what happens next. But how do you choose what happens next if you've never practiced choosing what happens next? That's not a thing. You know what I mean? That's why this, to some degree, I don't like the stuff that I was doing, walking home 2 miles in the second grade, and playing in the woods for 2.5 hours afterwards, and throwing each other down the fucking the cliff ravine and stuff. Probably wasn't a great idea, but there is something to be said for the low-level conflict resolution that you develop from situations like that. And I guess you learn how to manage risk without doing stupid shit, right? So you try. I think that's a big part of it. I think there's probably a bunch of these intersections throughout your life where you learn how to stay somewhere in the middle, and we've kind of removed all those away. You know what I mean? To some degree, kids still manage, I guess, but how does a kid know how to stay emotionally regulated if they're not allowed to get into emotionally precarious situations? Right.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I'd say there's two things. Like, this basic question of shouldn't we be teaching this to kids, right? How do we help kids to gain more control over their emotions, or to learn about their emotions? So one thing, it's two things. It's practice or experience, and it's also education. They don't have the conceptual apparatus like normally to really understand what's going on with their emotions. So there's some like verbal stuff, there's some conceptual stuff, like we've been talking about here, right? Maybe there's different types of anger, maybe there's different aspects of anger, like rather than just thinking of it as a kind of blob of energy that wells up inside you. That's a very crude, like overly simplistic way of thinking about our emotions. So teaching kids to understand, and maybe to label more granular distinctions, right, in a more insightful way, because the emotional apparatus that we inherit is not fit for purpose,
right?
Like it just isn't. It's overly simplistic, right? But also having opportunities to practice controlling our emotions, responding to them in healthier ways, for sure. Education and practice. I think we need both.
Why do you think? Why do you think we've dumbed it down so much? Right, because you mentioned it. You mentioned it early in the show. People look back at the Stoics and be like, "Oh, that's just like, why are you trying to apply that 2,000-year-old?" I mean, like, okay, I mean, we're still using farming techniques from about 3,000 years ago. We're still using farming irrigation techniques from then.
I'm going to say something that makes me cringe every time I hear myself saying it, right? But it's not going to stop me from saying it. The Stoics were way ahead of their time. Right? I can definitely say that in my field, in cognitive behavioral therapy. I think the Stoics were way ahead of guys like Sigmund Freud. I mean, it's crazy. Freudian psychoanalysis dominated psychotherapy for the first half of the 20th century. But Freud had no idea about some of the basic insights and techniques that the Stoics had 2,000 years earlier that then were rediscovered only in the latter half of the 20th century and supported by scientific evidence, right? So it does definitely seem to be the case that they have a more nuanced understanding. We have more simplistic concepts. I'll give you an interesting example, right? This is an easy example, so I mention it a lot. In the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 11, Chapter 18, right? That's how often I've cited this. He does something absolutely remarkable, like genuinely astounding. He gives a book, like a list of 10 cognitive strategies for managing anger. I used to teach psychotherapists and counselors and coaches and stuff for many years. And so very often I'd be standing in front of a flip chart in front of a room, and I'd say, hey, how many strategies can you guys think of for coping with anxiety, or maybe anger in this case, right? I can tell you, I'd be pretty impressed if a room full of 30 people came up with 5 or 6 distinct cognitive strategies. And I don't just mean different versions of the same thing. I mean fundamentally distinct strategy, like completely different strategies, right? I think they'd come up with 5, 6, 7, maybe a push. I don't believe that they'd come up with 10 fundamentally distinct strategies. Like, they need help to come up with that. That's a lot. He not only lists them, but he returns to selections from that list repeatedly throughout the book as if he knows it by heart and is genuine. Now, that's a level of understanding. And, I hesitate to say this, but it's the truth. That's a level of understanding that I would normally only attribute to somebody who is a professional teacher or a researcher who sat down and systematically classified a distinction between 10 different ways of managing an emotion. Marcus Aurelius was not a teacher or a professional researcher or therapist. So my only explanation for this is that he knew a guy who was. And then maybe one of his teachers was a specialist in anger and had dedicated his life to teaching it in classes, and therefore had this, well-polished classificatory system that we see Marcus quoting, and that he'd memorized and was using throughout his life. So, in the ancient world, not everyone had that level of understanding, for sure. But educated people in Rome and Greece had a level of understanding of emotional therapy conceptually and in terms of practical techniques that really would put us to shame.
Yeah, that's interesting. Certainly he would have had access to On Anger, I would imagine, and probably would have been taught from that to at least
probably
at least somewhat, right?
Yeah, he'd read Seneca. I don't know for sure that he would have read On Anger. He may have read it, but actually there were probably a bunch of other books that were similar. For a bit of context, probably less than 1% of ancient Greek and Latin literature survives today. And roughly about the same, the Stoics wrote probably thousands of books. We know of about 60 or 70 famous Stoic authors and teachers, but we only have substantial works from about 3 of them, right? We've got fragments and bits from other ones. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, wrote allegedly over 700 books.
Oh my God.
They were probably more like essays, right? But he was incredibly prolific. Some ancient authors were. So Marcus would quite possibly have seen several texts on anger. And Seneca's On Anger, by this time, in the Roman imperial period, it's unusual that philosophical works are very original. More often what they're doing is taking ideas from earlier works and kind of rehashing them, combining them in different ways, figuring out nicer ways to articulate them. That's mainly what Marcus Aurelius is doing. He's not really doing original philosophy. He's doing a kind of rhetoric of philosophy where he's taking all his favorite ideas from books he's read and trying to figure out how to express them perfectly in Greek. Actually, he was fluent in both Greek and Latin. So we have to thank him for that, because part of the work of writing philosophy, doing philosophy, is to figure out how to put it into words, and he's really good at doing that. But he would see himself as really taking all those ideas from earlier authors, and I think Seneca probably viewed himself in the same way. We actually have another essay from Plutarch on anger. It's not as long as Seneca's, but that also survives today. And we know that there were a bunch of others in circulation. Some of them go back many centuries earlier.
Yeah, that's curious. I wonder, there was something I wanted to ask you, because I don't really know the answer to this question. Were there...
Those are the best questions.
Yeah. Were there, was there contemporary dissent for Stoic philosophy, and what was it? And who were were there individuals who were writing like, oh, Seneca's a jackass or whatever, you know? It happens in academia all the time, so I'm just curious.
You mean like within Stoicism? Or
No. I mean like contemporary to the Stoics. Did they...
Other people?
Yeah, were there other people challenging their ideas with other ideas?
Yeah. You know, there were many schools of philosophy in the ancient world, and right out of the gate, there was conflict between them. So Socrates famously saw himself very much in opposition to a bunch of kind of quasi-philosophers called the Sophists. The Stoics, in what we call the Hellenistic period, sort of in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquests, in the Hellenistic world, that's when Stoicism first originated. The major schools of philosophy were Plato, Aristotle, the Cynics, the Epicureans, and so you kind of... People at that time, and for many centuries later, it's pretty cool in a way. They thought there's basically about 5 or 6 philosophies you get to choose between, almost, you know, like picking a team or something. Yeah, and Cicero, who's a famous Roman statesman, but highly educated in philosophy. He wasn't a Stoic, but he's one of our main sources for Stoicism because he knew so much about it. He was kind of sympathetic to the Stoics. He disagreed with bits of it. But Seneca has a book called De Finibus, where he compares 3 or 4 of these schools, and he just kind of lays them out. Like, here, you might want to compare them and sort of choose between them. That's something that's missing today. People saying, there's like a handful of basic perennial philosophies. This is what they look like. You know, you might want to choose between them. But sometimes they were on kind of friendly terms, and sometimes they could be quite hostile towards other people. So the Stoics definitely had other schools of philosophy. Some of the Cynics and the Stoics had quite a lot in common. The Epicureans and the Stoics tended to be at loggerheads with each other. To some extent, the Skeptics were quite opposed to the Stoics. Some of the Platonists, like Cicero, saw themselves as kind of cousins to the Stoics. That was the way the relationship between them worked out. And there were people who just thought, like today, there were people who thought philosophy was all BS, you know, and these guys are all up their own backside, and, you know, they had various other insults for it. They weren't into the whole idea. When Marcus Aurelius was emperor, there were people who gave him a lot of stick for being a philosopher.
Yeah.
On different levels. Some people said philosophers are all really effeminate. We don't want this guy in charge of the military. There were other people that said almost the opposite.
But didn't he capture more land for Rome than anybody prior to him? I mean, there's some statistic about the amount of territory that he captured. I don't remember what it is exactly.
He didn't really capture any territory per se, but what happened during his lifetime, Rome, the borders of Rome had largely stabilized under Hadrian, and then there was Antoninus Pius, and then there was Marcus Aurelius. So during this period, Rome remained pretty much the same size, roughly speaking. They decided against it. Like Hadrian had this policy against expansion because he thought, no, we need to consolidate our defenses and build up our infrastructure. Like we need to stop just like expanding for the sake of it, which is probably like a good idea. And Marcus didn't expand, but Rome had like many wars throughout over a period of about 19 years when he was emperor. He was almost continually at war. There was a huge invasion of the eastern provinces by the Parthians, this big empire to the east, and then all the Germanic tribes. I mean, like at least 10 different Germanic tribes all kind of combined forces and invaded across the Danube and got all the way down into the north of Italy. So what he did was drive back invasions. I guess you could say he recaptured territory that had been taken by various so-called barbarian invaders. And then he had a civil war. He was a busy guy.
Yeah, maybe that's what I was thinking of. He was at war the whole time he was emperor, but he was like also known as a philosopher, which is kind of interesting. Wait, what? You mentioned a book comparing the philosophies. What was the name of that again?
Yeah. We usually just call it by its Latin title. It's got a really convoluted title. It's a book by Cicero that we usually call De Finibus. Sometimes it's called On Moral Ends. The Latin name doesn't really translate that well into English, so we usually just call it De Finibus or On Moral Ends.
Interesting.
And it's a bunch of dialogues where Cicero portrays his friends kind of debating the pros and cons of different schools of philosophy. So it's a really good example of this idea that in the ancient world, philosophers almost set out their kind of stalls and you got to kind of choose between them.
Do you think that would even be possible today? Because I'm not sure that the religions are philosophies, strictly speaking, anymore.
No, I mean, in the ancient world, in a sense, this is a little bit reductionist, but people did think about philosophy in this way often. They said that different schools of philosophy can mainly be distinguished. There are many differences between them, but to a large extent, they can be distinguished by their definition of the telos, or the goal of life, or we might say the meaning of life. And that's kind of what the title means, definibus. It's referring to on the fundamental goal. So for Epicureans, the goal of life is ataraxia, or kind of peace of mind. And so many people might say, well, I think the fundamental goal of life is to attain a sort of tranquility or peace of mind, and that's what enlightenment, and that's what the purpose is. And for the Stoics, the goal of life is a kind of moral wisdom, and they said, well, even if you're experiencing stress and pressure and, that's okay as long as you achieve strength of character. And you need to expose yourself to some stress in order to achieve that. Whereas the Epicureans thought it was more important to withdraw from the stresses of everyday life in order to maintain tranquility. So is it tranquility? Is it strength of character? Is it knowledge? Is it a combination of virtue or wisdom and then some external things? Like that seems to be what the Aristotelians thought. Is it some kind of enlightenment, like the Neoplatonists thought, some mystical experience? In the ancient world, they thought there's only really a handful of recurring answers to that question, that people tend to lean towards, more towards one than the other. And it's useful to frame it like that, but we've definitely lost that.
Sure.
We're more confused today about what our options are in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of seems like those are all useful things that we might need, not for every individual, but for the community, right? Which is like, if you think about today, the two largest religions, well, let's say the three or four. I actually don't know what the purpose of life would be for Hindus necessarily. I'm not as familiar with that because they have too many gods to really dive into. I was talking to my lady about that yesterday, actually. But the goal, if you just frame it as the goal of life for Christians, it's soteriology, the study of the doctrine of salvation. I am a sinner and I have to get to God somehow. That's pretty simple. And Buddhists would say whatever, nirvana, right? Or that state. The Muslims would be something close to Christians, right? The pathway back to God, to paradise or whatever. But these aren't I'm not sure how you map those onto daily life and make life better for people necessarily, right? I mean, you could sit in a cave and meditate your entire life and reach nirvana, and how have you helped anybody? You could say that in the metaphysical world, I've done my proselytizing and I've helped people reach salvation or whatever, paradise or whatever you want to call it. But how have I actually helped somebody on earth? Because all of these religions also have admonitions to take care of people while you're on earth. But there seems like to be a divide between the philosophy and the practice, right? Yeah. Whereas in Stoicism, it was not even just Stoicism, but all of the ancient philosophies were more like, here are gifts to give you to make yourself the best possible person you can on this earth.
Yeah. This tension exists in the West and in Eastern thought between pursuing individual enlightenment or being, making the world a better place, basically, and helping mankind. So the tension is, people would say, well, look, if you get too engaged with public life and trying to help other people, you can kind of drive yourself crazy that way if you don't look after your own mental health. You might start to get too worked up about the injustices that you perceive in society, like too frustrated, too angry. It can become quite unhealthy. So you need to enlighten yourself in order to be able to help other people. But then if you spend too much time in a cave meditating, trying to enlighten yourself, it seems like you're not really helping society at all. So, the goal seems like it should be some sort of balance or some way of reconciling these two goals, these two desires that on the face of it look a little bit antagonistic, to each other. They can be hard. It's like a work-life balance, you know. It's like a little bit hard to reconcile the need for personal improvement and enlightenment with the need to go out in the world and benefit other people. The Stoics believed that they were able to balance those two things. So the Epicureans kind of put more emphasis on withdrawing from society. Epicurus, around the same time that Stoicism was founded, he set up his school outside the walls of Athens. His followers were a small circle of his closest friends. He didn't really go out and teach in public. Supposedly, he had engraved over the entrance to his garden, "Live in obscurity." So almost like a kind of retreat, like they sort of withdrew from the world and tried to focus on individual enlightenment. Whereas the Stoics taught in the Agora, which would be like standing out and teaching in the middle of a shopping mall. Like they went out and engaged with politics, engaged with everybody that they met, rich or poor, Athenian or foreigner. Like they really immersed themselves in the world and exposed themselves to the pressure and the stress in order to develop their character. But they also warned people that that could be overwhelming, and that you needed to think about the best analogy I think we find in Stoicism is they compare it a bit to sparring in wrestling and boxing, and they say you've got to pick a suitable sparring partner. So you don't want to pick somebody who's way better than you and who's just going to beat you to a pulp every time, but you also don't want to pick someone that's way too easy for you and you're not going to learn anything from. But the only way you could judge that is maybe with the help of a coach or through experience and self-observation, knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, but also as a human being. As a philosopher, you need to pick the right level of challenges for yourself. You know, maybe taking on. So Epictetus, for example, the most famous Stoic teacher, he talks that way to his students who are often wealthy Romans that are embarking on a political career as statesmen. You know, and he wants to say to them, you could be corrupted if you take on too much and get too involved with Roman politics. It's notoriously corrupting. But at the same time, if you just go and live like a monk and withdraw from society, you might just disappear up your own backside and not really benefit the world. So you need to judge what's an appropriate level of challenge for you and kind of push yourself. But if you go too far, you know, the risk is that you're going to forget about your moral values and just end up, you know, being dragged down to the level of other corrupt Roman politicians. You know, he needs a certain level of self-awareness to know what your limits are.
Yeah, I like that. I like that boxer analogy. That makes a lot of sense. I got to get out of here soon, but before we do, tell me about your book, How to Think Like Socrates. It's sitting on my shelf at home. I've had it for some amount of time. I think I got it. When did I get that? Probably in January, I think is when I picked it up. And, you know, it's the subtitle is Ancient Philosophy as a Way of Life in the Modern World, which I think is very useful. But tell me about the book and why you wrote it.
Well, I've written about 8 or 9 books, and that's probably the most popular one. That book has been translated into about 20 different languages, like, so it kind of took off unexpectedly. I was asked to write, I've been writing about Stoicism for a while, and I was asked to write an introductory book on Stoicism by a publisher, and I thought, I've already done that. I've got another book called Teach Yourself Stoicism that kind of does that. And loads of other people are writing books on Stoicism. So I went away and I thought, is there a way that I can answer this question yes and no? Like, how can I write an introductory book on Stoicism that's different from an introductory book on Stoicism? And I thought, long story short, that the way to do it would be by focusing on a historical figure. And Marcus Aurelius is the person, the Stoic, that we know the most about by far. So I thought it's easy to tell his life story through anecdotes and use him as a kind of role model. And I believe that historical anecdotes make things more engaging. Like, people relate to stories, you know, rather than just like a kind of lecture on, you know, Stoic theory and practice. Telling them these cool stories about the ancient world would keep them engaged. And I wasn't sure at first whether that would work or not. My publisher, actually, there are no other books like that, really. It's pretty unusual to write something that's a mixture of philosophy, psychology, and ancient history. You know, my publisher thought it was a weird combination to begin with, and they weren't sure whether it would work. But it did. You know, it took us by surprise, and people really related to it. And to come back to something you said earlier, you know, I think psychotherapists often take it for granted in a way they assume that we're just reaching everybody. I think partly because self-help is such a big thing today. We hear from so many people who go, I know about CBT because I've read loads of books and seen stuff on the internet. But we forget there are loads of people that wouldn't touch psychotherapy, CBT, or self-help books with a barge pole. And there are a lot of guys and women in the military that are kind of put off, like really turned off to things like that. So one of the first things I found was there were a lot of people reaching out to me. I get emails all the time from people that have read these books, and they'll say to me, I've never read a self-help book in my life. I'm not interested in that stuff, but I kind of like the movie Gladiator, and I sort of like Roman history and things like that. And so that's why I read your book. And then I started to really get into the CBT stuff that was in it. And it came as a big shock to me that we were reaching this demographic for the first time with stuff about CBT and self-help. So, yeah, that seemed to me incredibly valuable. These people aren't getting any exposure sometimes to these ideas. But when they do, they start to find it really interesting and really helpful.
I mean, it's hard not to. It's hard not to because it's so, like, regardless of how deep into stoicism you get, it is you're not going to be put off by the ideas or language like you are with some of this stuff. I mean, it's very deep thought, but it's also extremely practical in a way that no other philosophy, in my opinion, really is.
That was the first thing that drew me to it. Listen, before we wrap, I'll tell you why people tell me that they get into stoicism, right? It's pretty simple. There's I think 4 reasons. So what I hear over and over again from people at conferences and events. I've spoken to thousands and thousands of people over the past 25 years about how they're interested in Stoicism. So the common themes are they say I saw Stoicism as kind of like a Western alternative to Buddhism. I was kind of into Buddhism. I wanted something a bit like that, but I wanted something that was more consistent with my cultural values and norms, like as an American or a Brit or whatever. And Stoicism was kind of like Buddhism, like sort of Western yoga or something like that. Some of them will say, I wanted a secular alternative to Christianity. So they'll say, I'm kind of agnostic. Maybe I grew up Christian, but I'm not really religious anymore. I wanted something that kind of had similar values to Christianity, provided a sort of spiritual worldview, but was more philosophical. And they get that from Stoicism. Or they say, I want something that's kind of like academic philosophy, because I'm into that. I want to understand the world, but I want something that's more practical and down to earth than like Heidegger or Wittgenstein or whatever. So they see Stoicism as a more simple, more practical alternative to modern academic philosophy.
I remember reading it for reading about it and through some of these books for the first time, and I felt for the first time like the writer wasn't trying to impress me; they were just trying to give me information, I guess.
I feel when I'm writing about Stoicism, it's like I just know this. I've come across this thing that I thought was really cool, and my attitude is, I just want to tell other people about it. I just kind of want to share it with them, and make it easy. Like I had to rake through all these obscure books and kind of like study the original Greek and things like that. And I think that's all kind of unnecessary. I can just simplify that and make it more presentable so that more people can learn about it. So I think I was kind of curating information that would be hard for other people to access, and then I show it to them and they're like, oh my god, this is amazing, like this really resonates with me. But the other reason that people get into it is they say they want something that's kind of like self-help or CBT but bigger and deeper in scope. It's more like, because you do CBT, sometimes it comes across as if it's like a bunch of techniques. So you have CBT for like a couple of months or whatever, and you learn these techniques, and then you get kicked out. That's you're done, you're cooked. Now what? And you might think, well, maybe all the stuff I learned in CBT about how our beliefs affect our emotions has kind of implications for my entire life, my relationships and my career and everything. Like, this is a whole philosophy of life. But if you were to take those insights from CBT and turn them into an entire philosophy of life, you probably end up with something that's pretty similar to Stoicism. So people say, I wanted something like CBT or like the self-help books I'm reading, but more like a whole lifestyle, something that's permanent in scope.
Well, that's about as good an advertisement for Stoicism as you're going to hear.
There you go.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate the time. Tell everybody where they can find you and all of your books and all that. So I think you do a great, I've been following you for some amount of time now, and I think you do a great job of communicating these ideas.
Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure. Look, I've enjoyed talking to you. And if they want to find out, they can find a lot of what I do in Substack. I've got a lot of podcasts and a blog and stuff on Substack. And my most recent book is called How to Think Like Socrates. I recommend, by the way, if people are interested at all and they want to check this stuff out, listen to the audiobook because we put a lot of effort into making it really kind of dramatic. And it had 4.9 stars on Audible, so like people seem to really find it engaging, right? I wanted to make it like a really interesting story, where people felt like they really knew Socrates, but where he was asking them some pretty deep questions at the same time. So that's what I would say that I'd like them to check out if they want to check out something that I've written. But How to Think Like a Roman Emperor is the book that most people read. They can find all of these things on my website, which is donaldrobertson.name, or from all good bookshops and even some bad bookshops.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I like that. I like the, I guess you could call it dramatized version of some stuff. Because this is the way we communicate. We started in sitting outside or in a cave around a campfire, listening to some older person tell us stories about our ancestors, and then we moved inside and kept doing that. And then we had radio and then television and now memes on the internet or whatever. It's just the way we communicate. Jesus communicated in parables. The conversations between the Stoic philosophers, even Adlerian psychologists have written multiple books where it's a student and a pupil going back and forth on stuff. So I like that stuff. I'm glad you're doing it that way. And again, appreciate the time today. Everybody go check out donaldrobertson.name, and then all the books you can find on the internet, Audible, Amazon, all that stuff on your website. Thank you again for coming today. I really appreciate your time.
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.